podcast video cast on non-duality. There are a lot of them out there, although I find that although there are many listed, not all of them are active. So it might be an overstatement to say there's 16,000, but that's the number that Google came up with. And it's hard to see, it could be argued that there are way too many of these kinds of things already. So what do you have to contribute? Well, I do find that there are, I found an interesting Medium, an article on Medium that ironically created a taxonomy kind of a sort of non-dual podcast. That's exactly the opposite of non-dual, but I found it interesting that he categorized some as sort of hardcore or radical in the sense that they emphasize this idea that all there is now. In other words, this is all there is. There is just this, which is meant to say that it's not a moment, because that in itself would be dualistic in that there's a moment, then what is the next moment? Is that another the a moment? So those kinds of podcasts really just emphasize the perspective that we are only apparently speaking. There is no one that is speaking to another one, because it is all happening as part of a non-dual reality. And I find that, first off, that is as accurate. I find it as accurate a statement as can be formed using the limitations of the language of our present form. And so I take that as that understanding as an accurate representation of reality. And I keep coming back to this phrase, which is, and yet here we are, which is to say, we all have apparent existences. We all have apparent thoughts. We interact with our independent apparent selves, resulting in apparent outcomes. So with that understanding of non-dual, that sort of, I would say hardcore understanding of non-duality in mind, I answer the question, so now what? Here we are, yet here we are with these apparent lives and these apparent non-dual experiences. And it occurs to me, and this is informed greatly by a set of work that I came to many years before I even heard of the term non-duality, which is a Conversations with God series of books. And one of the major takeaways from that book in my life is this phrase, in the absence of that which you are not, that which you are is not, which is to say, and by the way, I don't think the term non-dual is included in any of the, there are literally dozens of books in this series. I haven't read dozens of them. I will say I have read at least a dozen, probably, not maybe a dozen and a half, if you count it that way. But I see it as a non-dual perspective. And in that phrase, one of the essential nuggets that helps you navigate the accuracy of non-dualism while at the same time living apparent individual lives and making apparent decisions. And that is in the absence of that which you are not, that which you are is not, which is to say that even God, and again, God guiding the universe, knows God is God, and yet the experience of God, being God, cannot exist without the apparent appearance of the opposite. So that relates to this non-dual understanding, and yet here we are. If you want to call it a conundrum, you can, because it's this God's way of God experiencing God's self, and that each of us in our apparent choices is God experiencing God's self. And the choices we apparently make either bring us closer to that experience of divinity or further away from it. And if you want to narrow the lens to the life on our planet that is primarily affected by the choices that we as these sentient humans make, apparently, it matters, at least in that experience of divinity. So, saying all that to say that this communication will focus a great deal more on, and yet here we are. We're taking as a given that each of our apparent existences is not, I will say, real from the vantage point of ultimate reality. They do apparently exist, and we are apparently making choices. So in a sense, let's make the best of it. And in the life of our planet, that's not a common understanding. It's not a common understanding of the nature of the universe. It's not a common understanding about the purpose of our lives. And that being the case, these kinds of communications are meaningful. And to the point of there being, hundreds of these non-dual communications, kinds of opportunities out there. In one sense, one can argue, wow, there are thousands of them out there. What more is there to say? But in another sense, you can ask yourself, well, this is a monumental, and I'm speaking in terms of in duality terms now. And you find that I feel like I need to qualify that because even though I believe and I'm convinced that these all apparent actions are not real in ultimate reality, they here we are. So let's meaningfully talk about things in the dualistic perspective, understanding its limitations. So if we look at the way we organize our lives, the way we think about the universe, the way we conduct our personal affairs, the way we conduct our governmental affairs, the way we interact with each other on the planet, not only does not reflect the non-dual understanding, it is I often think of this in terms of dartboards. It's like we're in this room where there's a dartboard, and apparently it's dark for whatever reason it's dark in this room, and the overwhelming majority of us are tossing our darts at the opposite wall of the dashboard of where the dartboard is, and wondering why we're not hitting the target. And there's a qualitative difference between tossing your darts on the opposite wall and turning around and tossing your darts, at least on the wall where the dartboard exists. That doesn't mean you're going to hit the bullseye, and that's a reminder to say that none of what I'm communicating here would be considered truth, because the truth is not expressible with the cognitive and linguistic tools we have at our disposal in this limited form. It's a little bit like the truth is over the horizon, and none of us is able to report experientially what is beyond that horizon. Of course, modulo some extension of our consciousness, like tools that fly. But I hope you understand my point without getting into the particulars there, or failing to understand that the point is our individual experiences are limited to what we have direct access to, if we can report on them accurately. And the idea that in our current form, with our means of cognition and linguistics, the idea of representing truth through that means, it strikes me as ludicrous. So I will spend a lot of time talking about the accuracy, meaning there are perspectives that I'm convinced are more accurate than others. The idea that we live in a dualistic universe where there is a creator that set about creating a universe and stands apart from that creation, and further, um, from our separated position from the creator judges our actions and will condemn any of us for the actions that we take, is strikes me as not an accurate representation of the nature of the universe. I think it's more accurate to say that the universe is God guiding, which is to say that the universe is God creating an apparent set of contextuality without which God would not be able to experience God's self. So therefore, we have the 10,000 things. And among those 10,000 things are these beings that call themselves sentient, who form thoughts and make apparent decisions. There'll be a topic on the topic of free will, because I have a very different, I think, view on what you hear in most contexts, where non-duality is discussed. I guess, spoiler alert, I'm not convinced there is not free will. Whereas I think it's a fair assumption that the consensus among people who talk about non-duality is that free will does not exist. You hear it all the time. I guess further spoiler, it's not because I think free will exists in the way that we understand will, which is to say that each individual, apparently separate being, physical being, can form a will using some form of cognition and have that be free will. I think we just don't have a clear enough understanding of the I. And if you have a broader understanding of the I, perhaps there is free will in that context. It's just not a question I can answer so definitively to say, no, we don't have it. So that's the spoiler alert about free will. But to try to unwind this this little web I've woven here, where was I? So I must have been. I think I was talking about the apparent, our apparent separateness, and the idea that we're in a position to describe, quote, truth or ultimate truth. I prefer to assess statements in terms of whether they are more or less accurate in relation to ultimate truth. So, going back to the way I was explaining it, the idea that the creator set itself apart from the creation, and the creation was set in motion, and the creator sets apart from the creation and judges the creation, and perhaps condemns its participants. To me, doesn't strike me as accurate as saying that what the apparent universe is God guiding, which is all that is, which is all this there is, and this is it. And the apparent choices we make are in the words, or in the way that Rupert Spira refers to it, is God, the dream of God. And in contrast to many who have kind of a nihilistic response to that, to me, that is that heightens the importance of the apparent choices that we make, in that each infinitesimal part of that which is God is essential. There is no even infinitesimal part of God that is not essential, including our thoughts. So those thoughts that heightens the importance of each thought, each choice, each interaction. And I'm learning to do this. But the idea of not expressing love in every interaction, to me, strikes me as not just a unfortunate choice, an unfortunate way to use our sentience. It's also a tragedy, in that moment could have been used to further express divinity, which is our basic instinct that comes from conversations with God, for those who are familiar with that work. And so getting back to the purpose of this, or the thrust of this dialogue that I'll be sharing with you, is really more about living non-dual, which is why I chose the term. It's about the choices that we make individually and collectively with the understanding of non-duality as the more accurate representation of ultimate reality, because I'm convinced that once that is truly internalized by enough of us, it will genuinely transform our planet. And that was reinforced by my recent introduction to this philosophical point of view called analytic idealism, and whose, I guess, most popular and most prominent proponent is Bernardo Castro. And having spent many hours listening to his work and more hours reading his books, that I think maybe was the final piece that fell into place that enabled me to at least turn around to the wall where the dartboard is, as opposed to tossing my darts against the other wall. And frankly, I think it also, in a sense, short circuits a lot of the free will talk and a lot of the discussion that happens in what people consider the hardcore non-dual spaces, which is to say that there's a lot of time and energy spent reinforcing the idea that our individual choices belong to the whole, belong to non-dual reality, and the idea that we're making individual choices can't hold with that understanding. And the premise of analytic idealism is that the fundamental or the ontological primitive of the universe is, as Bernardo says, is mentation. I would like to say consciousness, and the idea that there is a unitary consciousness through which each of us apparently exist makes it obvious then that we're not individual entities making individual decisions. So, in a sense, quite often I feel like, okay, well, that's axiomatic. Let's move on. But I realize that in many settings there are people who are being introduced to this anew, and it's radical. So I have more compassion is warranted. But that I won't be spending a lot of time in these communications reinforcing that point. I think I will have one episode where I essentially speak in those terms and have used that as a reference to say, well, even though I'm using relative language here, I'm using dualistic language in this when discussing topic X, Y, or Z. Please refer to this to understand what I'm convinced is the most accurate way that we can, in our limited forms, express the truth of ultimate reality, which in turn brings me to another, or you could say an aphorism that I return to frequently, and that is the aphorism from Niels Bohr, who was one of the prime framers of quantum mechanics, of quantum theory. And maybe this is the paraphrase, so I don't know Danish, so I'm not sure what he would have said in Danish. But the premise goes a little bit like this: there are two kinds of truths in the universe. There are trivial truths and there are great truths. Trivial truths, and you could replace dualistic and non-dualistic if you might want to do that if you're following along. And the trivial truth is a truth whose opposite is obviously false. I like to use the term color. Here, I mean, okay, this is my blank telephone here. As soon as that movie turns on, well, it was black, right? So to say that it is white is obviously not true unless you have some contrivance where you're you increase the magnification somehow to where it appears like, see, there's a pixel, that's why. But I think in dualistic terms, it's obvious that the opposite, to say that it is that screen is white is not, it's not true. That's a trivial truth. In Bohr's construction of those great truths or grand truths are truths whose opposite reveals another great truth. And that is of a great help to me when looking to contextualize that accurate truth I mentioned earlier, or that accurate statement I mentioned earlier about this is all there is this, meaning that speaking in dualistic terms really has no meaning in terms of ultimate reality. However, the opposite of that, if we were to extend Niels Bohr's aphorism, the opposite of that is another great truth that I think we, as in our, on this little tiny rock hurtling around what we call the Milky Way galaxy, are yet coming to grips with, and that is the opposite of that truth, which is another great truth that I seek to explore in these communications. So I think I've rambled along enough on this one, and let's wrap this one up and see you next time.